Hello and welcome to another episode of The State of Politics. I am again delighted to be joined by my co-host, Patrick McGill. Patrick, how are you doing?
Great, how are you, Declan?
I'm fine. As you'll know by now, I'm your usual host, Declan McConville, and this is the format we'll be running with. Today we are joined by Scottish Labour MSP, or what's going to be former MSP Neil Finlay. How are you doing?
I'm not bad, yourself?
I'm very well. Thanks for joining us, Neil. Just to kick off, could you give us a bit of a rundown on yourself, what you've been up to, and where you're at the moment?
Where am I? I'm in my office, clearing out my office because I'm ready to depart the scene. So looking through old files and shredding loads of material and getting packed up. I've been in Parliament for since 2011. Prior to that, I was a councillor in West Lothian since 2003. Were you guys born in 2003?
Yep.
Just about.
Just about.
That's what makes me feel really crap when I hear that was the same year I qualified as a school teacher. So I taught part-time as well as being on the council at that time. And then prior to that, I worked in the social housing sector as a housing officer. And prior to that, when I left school when I was 16, and I worked with my dad as a bricklayer, an apprentice bricklayer and a tradesman in the construction industry. I worked in that for about 10 or 11 years before, basically I left school with no very many qualifications. So I went to college in the evenings to get myself an education and then went to university, got enough qualifications to go to university. So that's my kind of CV since leaving school, if you like.
So Neil, how long have you been a member of the Labour Party?
I joined probably, I don't know exactly the year, it'd probably be about 88, 89. And that was on the back of the miners' strike. Miners' strike was happening in 84, 85. I was living in a mining community. I was fortunate that my dad and neither my dad or my mum worked in any way in the coal industry. And I was fortunate in that regard that, we didn't lose a year's income into the house or anything like that. But all around me, I could see what was going on. I had pals whose dads were miners. There was women who worked in the pit canteen, worked in the offices and all that kind of stuff in the community who were on strike for a year. And seeing all that going on round about me was what politicised me. And I watched every bit of that. You guys are at Strathclyde. My brother-in-law was studying at Strathclyde at that time. He was doing politics and social and economic history, and we, discussed everything that was going on, and it politicised us. And one of my other pals, Maz, was the secretary of the local Labour Party, and she told me, get yourself joined, get active. And I went along to an anti-poll tax meeting that was being held in the Miners' Welfare Club. And I went to that. And afterwards, my pal's mum sort of ushered me into the other room in the club, and that's where the Labour Party meeting was being held. And that was the first time I went. So ever since then, I've been involved in one way or another over the last, 30 years or so. Seems tragic to say that it's been 30 years, but it has been, I'm afraid.
And in that
Neil,
time...
sorry, Patrick. No, on you go.
All right. In that time, you say you became a councillor in 2003. That was the same year that we went to war in Iraq. Has your membership ever wavered? Have you ever considered maybe this isn't the best party to be in for social progress?
Has my membership wavered? Of course it's wavered. And Iraq was probably the biggest waiver that I had. But ultimately, I do believe I'm a socialist. So I believe that, in fact, I've been reflecting on this recently. I actually believe now more than ever in my life, my political life, that socialism is the answer to the big problems that we have in our society. If you look at issues about climate change, if you look at issues around inequality and exploitation and war, look at all of those issues. It is inconceivable that the answer to those problems is more free market economics and more neoliberalism. Just inconceivable. That's what's got us to the problem. That's what's got us to the crisis that we're in at the moment. And the idea that the answer is more of that is just, to me, complete nonsense. However, your question was about have I wavered, and I have wavered over the years. Without doubt, I wavered over the years. But I kept coming back to the belief that socialism is the answer to the questions. And you know, we don't call it a struggle for nothing. It is a struggle, and you've got to convince people, and you've got to debate and argue and all the rest of it. And there are times when you win, and there's times when you lose, and that's the nature of the political cycle.
Neil, as you said, that you'd been in Labour for a long, long time, and when you joined the party, it was in amongst the fractured years. So 10 years after that, you saw Labour being eventually elected to government. At that point in 1997, how optimistic were you about the future of a new Blair government and a new Labour government after so many years of Tory governments?
Well, I mean, the Tory years were absolutely appalling. In my own community, at one point, unemployment was 26%. After the pit shut, after British Leyland shut, Ravenscraig and all the rest of it, 26%. I mean, I've got pals who, for people who are just a wee bit older than me, who, like, for 10 years never had like what you would call a full-time job. They were on, you know, youth opportunity schemes, or, you know, at that time you got 20 quid a week for, you know, being on one of these schemes. I went through a youth training scheme myself, £27.50 a week. Now, I was fortunate. I worked with my dad. He got some subsidy for the government to take me on, and he gave me extra wages, you know, at that time. But others who I was at school with, and guys who are my mates, they were on, you know, youth opportunities or YTS schemes. It was dire. It was absolutely dire. And when the Blair government came in, there was huge optimism. And what we shouldn't allow is people to rewrite history about what that government did or didn't achieve, because it achieved many, many, many good things. Many good things. I mean, huge numbers of people were lifted out of poverty with tax credits, increase in child benefit, pension credits for older people, free TV licences. Labour was putting in Scotland free central heating so that people's homes were warm at that time. You know, free bus passes. All of this stuff was brought in by that Labour government, and we should never ever forget that. We had continuous economic growth. Unemployment fell dramatically. There was massive investment in public services that were crying out for investment, schools and hospitals and, you know, roads and infrastructure. And there's a tendency for people to rewrite history when they look back on that time. And I think that, you know, without doubt, for me, Iraq was the, you know, fundamental error that government made. And that clouds a lot of judgment as to what it achieved or didn't achieve. I am no fan of Tony Blair, never have been, never will be. But that government did a lot of good things that have been forgotten about.
You were talking there about how neoliberalism has gotten us into the situation we're in now, where there's every 10 years there seems to be a crisis.
Yeah.
We sort of made the move to neoliberalism when Thatcher first got elected in 1979, when sort of Keynesianism ran into problems.
Yeah.
How does an economy shaped by a left-wing political ideology get past crises like there was in the late 1970s, so that we don't make another lurch to neoliberalism whenever a crisis occurs?
That's a very good question, and it's probably the eternal question that people wrestle with about the future of how we develop the economy and society, isn't it? And you know, these are huge debates. I think, to me, I think there has to be a realization amongst people that continuing as we are is how you lurch from crisis to crisis, because you have a period of, a period of boom and a period of bust, and you have that cycle of, huge wealth accumulation in private hands, and at the other end of the spectrum, you have people queuing up because we can't feed our own people. And there has to be another way in which we have an economy that the pursuit of the holy grail of economic growth is not the only game in town, that we have to start to talk about how we create the contented and happy society where people, people's objectives are that you live a fulfilled and happy life, that your children grow up contented and live a fulfilled, happy life. And that the answer to that, having that fulfilled and happy life, is not just, a bigger car, a bigger house, a bigger bank account. Now, that's a big challenge to try and create that. But if anything has taught us how grotesquely unequal our society is, it must be the last year with this pandemic, because it has been grotesque.
Neil, on that, you spoke about continuing as we are. But when Jeremy Corbyn was elected as Labour leader 6 years ago, we saw a very different policy plan, a man who had moved away from that kind of central ideas that Labour had campaigned upon under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband. Why do you think that was so badly rejected by British people? And do you ever see a point where we can move past the point of being so dismissive of those ideologies? For instance, on the free Wi-Fi, that was something that was scoffed upon in that 2019 general election. Now we're 2 years on and everybody's gone, oh, it's a great idea, because as you say, in the past year during the pandemic, we're seeing kids, they don't have access to Wi-Fi, that education has fallen behind.
Yeah, I mean, I chaired Jeremy Corbyns' 2 campaigns in Scotland when he was standing for leader. Very proud to do so. He's a very good friend of mine and he's a good comrade. And it's one of my greatest regrets is that he did not win that 2017 general election, because that Labour government would have transformed this country massively for the better in the interests of working people. And, it's interesting how those ideas, I mean, that 2017 manifesto was an excellent manifesto. It wasn't the most radical manifesto I've ever seen in my life. To me, it was just sort of common sense, democratic socialism. That's what it was. It wasn't, it wasn't the Communist Manifesto by any manner of means. But it had a whole series of practical, common sense policies within it that attracted people. And we saw people, particularly in Scotland, coming back to Labour. We were 3,500 votes. There was 20 seats where we were only up to 3,500 votes behind. Some only 65 votes behind, 130 votes behind. That could have been massive if Scotland had just taken another step towards supporting that Corbyn project, because we could have won that election. It's a great regret of mine. I've never seen a campaign of media vilification of a political leader in Britain. Certainly not since Tony Benn was at his peak. The extraordinary attacks on Corbyn, a man who all his life has fought against discrimination, becomes overnight a racist. A man who's fought for peace and justice becomes a terrorist sympathiser. It was absolutely disgusting and disgraceful and complete and utter nonsense. And it shows you the power of the media. It shows you the power of, vested interests who feared that a Corbyn government was going to come in and challenge the establishment and challenge the economic orthodoxy. It just shows the power that they have.
you're speaking there about the media. You're on A State of Mind just now. I think when Richard Leonard resigned, you went on to Novara Media, which is based down in London. What role do you think independent media has in the next 10 years and in trying to build a left-wing movement or alternative government?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I think these new outlets and these platforms that everybody's now got access to are really, they are challenging the sort of prevailing orthodoxy of, you know, the established networks and all the rest of it. There's a long way to go, and of course there's the big challenge of fake news and, you know, all of that stuff as well. You know, it's all very well us three having a chat, and we've got, you know, two very sensible and rational people to have a chat with. That's not always the case in some of these platforms, and we see that with some of the rather madder elements that are at play in Scotland at the moment. But I think they do have an important role in giving a voice to, I think giving a voice to people who aren't often heard within the media. I think that's a really important role, and actually having serious discussions without it becoming just people lobbing boulders at each other. You know, serious sort of philosophical discussions about big issues, and getting people who are in the chalk face, at the coal face of some of these issues in society, getting to hear them is hugely important.
Neil, a lot of my friends joined the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, and consequently, when Keir Starmer became leader, left the Labour Party.
Yeah.
What would your message be to those people? Because a lot of people just see Keir Starmer as an old tried and tested that, yes, might win elections, but isn't the man to transform a society. And what would your message be to those people?
Well, you know, I would say that we've got battles to win, and the reason Corbyn won was because people like you're talking about, who could have left many times over the decades, didn't. And I look at people like Jeremy, like John McDonnell, you know, previous people like Dennis Skinner, Tony Benn, and all the rest of it, who for 30 years were in the wilderness. Nobody took them seriously. Nobody wanted to discuss anything with them. They were pointed at as some sort of weird cranks who, you know, were away talking to themselves. And you can, by the way, I'm quite happy to be put in that camp as well. But they had people round about them who believed. They had people who, and it was not about them as individuals. It was about what they articulated and represented as a movement. And had people been fair weather friends to them, then Corbyn would never have got his opportunity when the time came. So my message would be, don't walk away. You know, the mantra of the Labour movement is organise. You've got to organise to win. And when you get out organised, the other side win, or another debate wins. So if you walk away, you leave the field empty for those who want you to walk away. And it's the biggest mistake that anyone can make, is saying, oh, well, you know, my guy didn't win this time. We're all packing up the tent and walking away. Oh, and by the way, when somebody else organises and you maybe come back with somebody that I like, oh, well, I'll come back at that point. Well, that's a cop-out. I see Patrick with his colours over his wall there. I'm sure Patrick doesn't rip that wallpaper down every time his team gets beat. I think he
nearly does.
Well, he
does stick with it.
Doesn't happen that often.
Were they was red, white, and blue last week?
Oh, definitely not.
but there you go. It's you know, too many football analogies in politics, but it is, you don't rip down your colours the minute things start going wrong. You reorganise and you come back again. And you know, for young people in particular, you know, I can't conceivably see if you believe in socialism, where you would go. Now, a lot of people have gone over to the nationalists, some will go to the Greens and all the rest of it. But my view is that there's always been that strong socialist strand within the Labour Party. It'll always be there, and our time will come again.
So obviously we've got a year of Keir Starmer now. He started off pretty well, but ever since the new year, his ratings personally and obviously for the Labour Party as well have gone down. Contrast that with Anas Sarwar, who's made quite a good start. What do you think of these of Labour's new leaders, and how do you think they'll fare, and if they are the right people to take Labour into an election?
Well, I never voted for any of them, however, they won, and I'll back them. I think Starmer's been a huge disappointment for me. I think he's a very bright guy, but I dealt with him. I was the shadow Brexit spokesperson up in Scotland, and he was doing Brexit down in Westminster. He was a very bright man. He was completely on top of his brief, as you expect from a fairly well-known lawyer, very skilled lawyer, and I was impressed with him. I am not impressed by his conduct so far as leader, and that saddens me greatly. I think there's a bit of an analogy with Gordon Brown there, and I think he is listening to the wrong people, and I think Gordon Brown listened to the wrong people around him as well. If Gordon Brown had been allowed to be himself and had allowed himself to be himself, I think he would have been a far more successful Prime Minister. I think Starmer is listening to people who he thinks may have his best interests at heart, but I think are going to destroy his leadership if he allows them to, and the quicker he gets shot at them, the better.
Neil, just quickly, you touched on being the shadow Brexit minister there. Can you give us a wee kind of idea of what goes on between a Scottish shadow Brexit minister and a UK Parliament shadow Brexit minister? What kind of conversations you have, how much contact you have with each other?
Yeah, quite a bit, to be honest with you. Obviously Brexit was predominantly playing out at Westminster, but there was very significant parts of it playing out up here. Actually, one of the people who I was in contact with most was in the Welsh Assembly, Mark Drakeford, who's now the First Minister. His special advisor, who was a real, absolutely first-class advisor, knew the Brexit issues inside out completely. He was absolutely tremendous to deal with, and I was speaking to him at times, a couple of times a day. I spoke to Keir Starmer fairly regularly. We did events up here, meetings, all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of chat goes on at various times, but during all of that, the pressure on the likes of him was immense, because they're getting pulled all over the place, speaking to, whether it's businesses, speaking to, legal representatives of different sectors. I mean, it was crazy at that time. It really was, and so yeah, a lot went on at that time. A lot.
You're saying how he was the shadow Brexit secretary under Corbyn. He campaigned for Remain during the referendum, and then at the 2017 election, said that he would respect the result of the referendum. Yeah. Then he campaigned for a people's vote, in which he would vote Remain, and now he's saying that we should not look to rejoin the EU, and that argument is over. Do you think he's sort of compromising his values a wee bit, and sort of?
Well, your question, Patrick, is very well put. I have to say, you've got a future. You'll be a future Paxman, I think. It's very well put, because it sums up the kind of contradictory forces within the Labour Party, the Labour movement, and the Labour voters all during Brexit, where people were taking all sorts of positions. And what really, really, really annoyed me was that those people who had a fixed position and were demanding that their fixed position was the one that the party should take, did not care a jot about the other side of the debate. So, for example, say a London MP in a very strong Remain constituency, demanding a people's vote and, fingers in the ears to those in, in Gateshead or Blythe or whatever, who were getting the complete opposite from their constituents. And equally as bad, the person in the north saying, "Oh no, we've got to take the other position." That to me was just that to me was wrong. It was a very difficult issue, and instead of two lots of people shouting at each other saying we're right, there didn't seem to be any attempt to understand the real difficulties that Labour had with its voters, who were basically their Labour voters were split. Now, myself, I've always been very, very sceptical of the European Union, and particularly its economic policies. And since I came into the politics way back in the late 80s, early 90s, I was very much of the anti-Maastricht Treaty, anti further European integration, superstate and all that kind of stuff. So right up until the referendum, I was going to be voting Leave, and I voted Remain. And I still, to this day, am torn by my vote. My postal ballot paper came in and sat on my kitchen table, and it haunted me for 3 weeks. I kept sort of creeping past it, trying to avert my gaze from it so that I didn't need to fill it in. And I was always going to vote Leave up until I saw Nigel Farage launching a poster that depicted children getting on a train during the Holocaust, and he was making out that this would be what would happen to the UK if we remained in the EU, and it was disgusting. It was absolutely disgusting imagery to use. And at that point, I grabbed my postal ballot and filled it in for Remain and put it through the post box, and probably a couple of hours later started to regret what I did. But I still to this day don't know whether I made the right decision or not. I'm still pretty tortured by that decision.
Neil, on Brexit, obviously a big constitutional question in Scotland. You could see we've kind of been haunted by another constitutional question. As a party, do you think Scottish Labour's been constitutionally lost to an extent?
I think Labour's position on the Constitution has been so frustrating. Since I came into the Parliament, I argued from day one that we needed a clear position that the Labour Party could campaign on, and that position should be, well, I wouldn't have called it this, and I don't really want to call it this, but make it easily understood, the Devo Max position, that we should have taken a position that was very distinct. We should have had nothing to do with the Better Together shambles. I had nothing to do with that. I campaigned alongside a group called the Red Paper Collective, and that was a group from the Labour left and the Communist Party and the trade unions who tried to develop a different option. And we tried to get that through the Labour Party conference, and there was a big fudge that made it not happen. And to me, that was a disaster. You can't spend the whole part of your history telling everybody that the Tories are the biggest bastards on planet Earth, and then stand side by side with them saying, vote for us. It was catastrophically awful. And I did 65 public meetings during that referendum. Certainly, one of the most in the country. Not arguing from a Better Together position. Arguing for a position that said we want more powers devolved to the Scottish Parliament, but where it makes sense to leave powers where they are, then they should be left where they are. And I've developed that much more now than I had then. So my position is that all powers should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament unless there's an overwhelming reason not to. And there are very legitimate reasons why you wouldn't devolve some powers. So, for example, I'll give you two examples. Scotland's got the worst drugs deaths in the entire developed world. Why would we not devolve power to allow local government, communities, and the Scottish Parliament to address the issues drugs in the community and deaths in the community? That, to me, is just common sense. But equally, we live in a small island nation. Why would we create internal borders in that small island nation with all the consequences that means? Why would we set up a new border agency? That doesn't mean that we can't have a flexible immigration policy. We can. But we don't need to set up all new border arrangements and passport arrangements and all of that. So I would leave those powers where they are. And my argument is that you could work through all of those powers and you could start to understand where the best level is that those powers should lie. And then you slot those powers into that level. Now, some of that will be at a Scottish Parliament level. Much of it will be much lower down at a community level or at a local government level. Because one of the things that the Scottish Government has done is sucked up powers from local communities and local government. And that needs to be reversed as well. So my view is that we need Labour should have in 2014, but most certainly should now have a third option that goes on the ballot paper, and that should be in effect a Devo Max option, and that people can have a greater democratic choice as to what the future of Scotland should look like. I think if there's a credible third option put on the ballot paper, I think it would win.
So, talking about a sort of third option on a ballot paper there, I think Keir Starmer's position is to try and build a federal UK, whereas you're sort of saying Devo Max on a referendum ballot. Would you be better off sort of trying to create a federal UK and then having a binary referendum? Or do you think you'd be better off having a referendum quite soon with three options?
Yeah, well, I ultimately would prefer a federal UK, but the problem is that the UK is not ready for that. Actually, I would recommend, you guys are politics students, I would recommend a piece of work that's been done I think it's called Remaking Britain, and it's by Sean Griffin, who I think may have gone to Strathclyde or might be in Glasgow, who's a constitutional lawyer. It's a terrific piece of work, very, very extensive piece of work on the UK Constitution about completely remaking the British state. It's very, very good, and it's actually not had the coverage that it should have done, because it's one of the most significant contributions to the debate around the future of the UK state in many years. Yes, ultimately I would like to see a federal UK, but if you look at the UK, actually, look at all the different sort of levels of government that we have. In the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly, Northern Ireland Assembly, the Greater London Assembly, you've got metro mayors, you've got unitary authorities, you've got parish councils, police and crime commission, God knows what. I mean, there's so much of it, it's all over the place. And if ever there's a time where it needs rationalised and some sanity brought to it, then I think it's now. But that would require massive local government reform in England. And people have got their little fiefdoms, their empires. Are they willing to give that up? Because one thing's for sure, I doubt if people will vote for another level of government and another lot of politicians. So, whilst that might ultimately be my long-term objective, Scotland can't wait for that. We should develop our own package of devolution, and we should forge ahead showing how it can work and how it can work in the interests of working people.
Neil, on Scottish Labour, obviously you've spoken there about constitutional matters. How do you think, apart from the Constitution, Scottish Labour can start to pull back voters that they've lost to the SNP in the past 14 years?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think unless there is a credible constitutional offer, then that will be very difficult. What depresses me greatly about Scottish politics at the moment is that every issue from dog shite to international crime is seen through the lens of the constitutional question. That, you know, you cannot discuss the drugs crisis and it becomes a debate about powers being devolved, as if devolving, you know, just devolving the powers makes it all work. Like the England and Wales operate with the same powers that Scotland has, and yet we have 4 times the drug deaths. So clearly it's not the powers that are the problem. If you look at all other issues, you cannot debate the NHS, you cannot debate housing, you cannot debate anything, and it becomes a de facto debate about the Constitution, which is so depressing, because that means that holding government to account for bloody awful decision making, incompetence and mismanagement it just doesn't happen, because people's first position is, well, I'm going to be loyal to them because they take my position on the Constitution. And that's, you know, it's so frustrating. If you look at our public services at the moment, record waiting times in the NHS boards and special measures, budgets bust. If you look at ferry contracts that are years over date, hundreds of millions of pounds over date, hospitals that have been being paid at 1.5 million a month and not treated a patient. We've got a mental health crisis. If you look in every sector, look at things like BIFAB, look at the closure of the Calais Railworks. We've got government decisions that are absolutely awful. Public money being burned at a rate of knots for very bad decisions. And yet, they're still well ahead in the opinion polls, because let's fly a flag and let's shout freedom, and that will rally people to the cause. And that is a very depressing outlook.
Neil, I know you in recent days, I know you were trying to push for to hold the government to account in care home deaths, that it appeared that the death of a duke was more important than COVID deaths in Scotland.
The situation in care homes over the last year has been absolutely ghastly, and the treatment of older people during this pandemic, older people in care homes, I think has been a human rights catastrophe. And I pursued that issue from the very beginning. And we had staff in care homes who are some of the lowest paid people in the health and care sector. Didn't have the PPE they needed to care for people. They weren't getting tested. Then the government decided overnight to discharge elderly people untested into the care home sector, allowing the disease to run riot through the sector. Some of us from day one tried to hold the government to account for that, and were chastised by Jean Freeman and the First Minister for doing so, said that we were politicising the issue, and there was complete denial that there was any problem. And when we found that they were still months later discharging people into care homes untested or COVID positive patients into care home, again, we got criticised and attacked for raising that issue. And to me, this week we had the 10,000th death in Scotland. There's this mythology that somehow Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Government handled the COVID crisis well. It has been dreadful. They've done exactly the same, almost step by step, as the UK government's catastrophic handling. Some differences, not a great deal of difference, but we've got one of the highest death rates per head of population in the EU. And the care home sector has been the worst decision of them all. And then what do we get this week? The Cabinet Secretary for Health, who's departing the scene, who has been in denial every time politicians have tried to hold it to account on the floor of Parliament, leaving Parliament and then saying, oh yes, we made mistakes. The first admission of errors in the care home sector, and we had no opportunity to hold them to account for that. So my view was on Monday that the Parliament had been recalled by the presiding officer to pay tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh. Now, you know, the Parliament was always going to do that. So be it. But my argument was they're going to make those arrangements. There'll be quite a bit of expense involved in bringing staff back, cleaning the place, doing all the stuff that has to happen, broadcasting and all the rest of it. We could have had a break after the tributes were paid to the passing of the Duke, and we could have returned in half an hour or an hour, and we could have questioned the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister on these revelations. That was refused. That was refused. So it does lead you to the conclusion that the death of one elderly man, a very important man in the, of course, in the public's view, was more important than the death of thousands of others in our care home sector. And I think that kind of sums up the attitude that people have had, political leaders have had to older people in this country. In my view, they're the people who have made our country what it is. They've contributed all their lives. They've brought people into the world. They've, worked in the NHS. They've worked in the public sector. They've built businesses, and yet they're just been seen as collateral damage in the battle against COVID. And I think it is outrageous. And I hope now. I wrote last year to Police Scotland to ask if they would be interviewing the First Minister, senior ministers, and advisors about their role in the deaths of all of these care home residents. And they said to me at that point that it was up to those leading the investigation and they would make the decision. Well, I certainly hope they're going to be investigated now.
You said earlier about drug deaths as well. I think it was 1,200 odd people died in 2019 because of drug deaths. Obviously, the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the powers just now, or local government doesn't have the powers.
Powers to do what, Patrick?
I think it's to legalise or decriminalise drugs. I'm not entirely sure on that. You'll know more than me, but I think that's the case.
Just so I could clarify what exactly it was.
Aye. So there's been, I think in Glasgow, they tried to do consumption rooms and it was shut down for some reason. And then obviously in America and in the Netherlands as well, there's a lot of drugs that are decriminalised or even legalised for recreational use. What are your views on that, and just sort of how should, say, cannabis be legalised for recreational use and then other drugs like cocaine decriminalised so that they can be treated as a health matter or something like that?
All drugs, if you had asked me this 10 years ago, I would have been quite puritanical and very anti-drugs because I've seen what it does to some people in my community. I live in the former mining community that, has many social issues, and drugs is one of them. It's one of the few issues in my life where I've changed my view 100%. I would decriminalise all drugs tomorrow. All drugs tomorrow. And I've said that publicly. I've said it in Parliament. Actually, when I first said it, I thought I would get absolutely hammered for it. And I was astonished at how few people criticised me in the public, constituents. I got very little criticism for it. And my view is that the war on drugs has been a disaster. We've got more drugs than ever. We've got more organised crime than ever, making greater profits than ever. And that has been in a war on drugs that spent zillions of pounds attempting to end the supply of drugs. And it will never happen. You'll never arrest your way to a drugs-free society. It just simply will never happen. So we have to treat people who have got an addiction, and we have to help them to remain alive in the first instance, but also for those who we can help to get off drugs, then we help them. Because if you ask, I've met many drug users, academics working in the field, drugs workers, families of people who have died. If you ask them their sons and daughters who have been through addiction, what do you want? They'll all say, I want off drugs. None of them are having a whale of a time injecting in manky closes and lying in a shop doorway, or not all. That depiction can often cloud their judgment, because not all of them are like that. But for those people who are at that chronic end of it, it is a grim life. For others who may be living with family, trying to hide their addiction, then that is as soul destroying and damaging for them. It's a very difficult situation for all concerned. So my view is that I think in one of the speeches in Parliament I gave 16 different examples of things that we could do now. With the powers that we have, we could do them now. And at that point we were doing none of them. So for example, simple things, drug testing at festivals and events, we could do that now. They do it in Wales. You can sit at home, and Wales, they've got a system, you can sit at home, you can send an ecstasy tablet through the post, and you can have it tested and they'll tell you the result of that test. We don't do any of that stuff. Last year or 2 years ago, the police put out a warning because there was a dance festival going to be on at Ingliston in Edinburgh, a warning saying, if you bring drugs, our dogs will be there. We will do this, we will do that, and you will be arrested. That's the messages we're putting out. Does that encourage people to try and act responsibly and keep themselves safe, or does it encourage them to take more risky behaviour? And my argument is it encourages more risky behaviour, which results in more deaths.
Yeah, to conceal it. I think I seen that the government could challenge the Lord Advocate or something to make consumption not legal, but sort of decriminalise consumption or something. I'm not entirely sure.
The Lord Advocate could simply issue an instruction not to the police not to prosecute. Okay, not to, so you've got Peter Cryken, a former drug user, off his own back, buying an old minibus, converting it off his own money, and going out and supervising people to inject drugs safely so that they don't come to harm and die. He has naloxone out there so that if they overdose, that can be reversed. And government ministers have got the audacity to say this guy's doing good work. He's doing good work. What bloody work are they doing? Why should it be left to that man to go out and do? That man is absolutely, he should get sainthood immediately for what he's doing. And ministers sit back and say, we can't do anything. It is utter bollocks. They could do it today if they wanted to. It is shameful, and it's an absolute outrage what's going on.
I think he'd be a person we'd like to see in Parliament, Neil, because he's leading the way on this, and as you say, the government have got this badly wrong, and we've even seen that in Cabinet when they've appointed Angela Constance now to tackle the issue. But unless they make drastic changes, we're just going to keep going down the same path.
Absolutely. Listen, I sat as chair of the Health Committee in Parliament, and the Cabinet Secretary then, Shona Robinson, came forward with a £26 million cut in the drug and alcohol budget. At the time, the numbers had just reached record levels. And we questioned her, we campaigned, we argued, and we said, why are you doing this? This makes no logical sense. Why are you doing this? And was it any surprise that the following year, the numbers went up again and again and again? It has been a disaster. And the minister who was there, Fitzpatrick, was utterly clueless, utterly clueless. And I called for his resignation ages ago, and thankfully we got rid of him. Now, I know Angela Constance, I stood against her many times. She's a councillor beside me. She will do a better job, but it wasn't a high bar that was set, I have to say.
No.
And if this does not bring about new budget, new policy, then we will have more deaths yet again.
It's a big worry, and I don't know where the government's going to go with this unless they get their act together on it, because as you say, unless there's a new approach to it, we're just going to keep going as we are, which is a big worry. On that, Neil, do you think as a Parliament we need to work together on this? Because I know the Tories in the last Leaders TV debate, Douglas Ross had said no way, he doesn't support it. Do you feel as a Parliament we need to kind of come together to look at this issue? I know government could do more, but
look
other parties dismissing it.
See all this come together stuff, right? This gets played when governments are in trouble, okay? Because most of the time, They don't want to come together. They want to impose their will on Parliament. But the government would not bring, I don't know how long it took. They hadn't had a drugs debate in Parliament for something like 5 years because they wanted to avoid it because the figures were going up. And then it's all, oh, let's all come together. I mean, I said in Parliament, I said this absolutely clear. Fitzpatrick said we need consensus over this issue. And I said to him, let me tell you this, stuff your consensus. It's consensus that's got to where we are at the moment. It doesn't need consensus. Consensus will be a disaster because it will be all the groups and all the agencies who have failed to challenge and who have taken us to where we are, all patting each other on the back, all agreeing with each other, and mere folk will die. We don't need consensus on some issues. We need thorough argument, debate, and if disagreement brings action, so be it.
100%, 100%. Looking towards the election and afterwards, there's been a pledge from the SNP, who will probably win, whether it's a minority or a majority, to build 100,000 affordable homes with 70,000 for social rent. Do you think that is enough?
No. And let me tell you this. You watch this. My office has been doing some research on this, and hopefully this will come out in the next week or so, how fraudulent all of this stuff is on housing. Absolutely fraudulent. I can't say too much at the moment, but watch what the definition is of social rented housing. Watch who's getting all the grants for this. I think what they want to do is massively expand the private rented sector. I think that's the agenda here. And you'll see some very powerful and influential people gaining massively from this. We saw it the other week. We exposed a story for the Sunday Mail about a company who gives donations to the SNP winning having planning permissions overturned in their favour and all of that stuff. And there's much more to come in that. Any councillor, any MSP will tell you the biggest issue they face is housing, the demand for housing.
Neil, after this election, what would you like to see in the next 5 years of the Parliament and for Scotland as a country? What direction would you like to see us taking? What big issues would you like to see tackled?
I would like to see the Parliament have people of independent mind within it, not a bunch of people who will just come in and be told what to say by their party whips, and people who will stand up and be counted on the big issues. And if that means they take a different view from their party, whichever party that is, then they're all for the better, because there's not enough people like that. I hope the country takes a very significant turn to the left. If we see an SNP majority government, I think that would be a very bad thing. If we had an SNP majority government last time, you would still have the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, you would still have the Education Act, you would still have the Named Person Scheme, you would never have had the Period Poverty Bill, and I could go on. You would still have a drugs minister in place who hadn't a clue what he was doing. All of that stuff would continue with a majority government, because they would just use their parliamentary muscle to ensure that happened. And that is the biggest danger for Scotland, is an SNP majority government that thinks it can do what it likes and implement some really guff policy. And that's the biggest danger we have. I hope that people, whatever happens on the Constitution, I hope they absolutely reject the Growth Commission model that the SNP are putting forward as being the model for an independent Scotland. I think that would be utterly disastrous. And I hope that Labour comes to its senses and puts forward a credible position based on maximum devolution and redistribution, whilst retaining links across the UK, so that we don't throw out the good stuff that goes on, particularly redistribution of resources across the UK.
Just finally from me, Neil, I believe you got a book out in July. Is that right?
I have, yes. Yep.
what's that about basically, and then what's next for you after Parliament? Because you've obviously chosen to stand down. You've not been voted out of anything.
Yeah.
What are you choosing to do next?
Well, I'm looking for a job. If you've got a job for me, let me know. Starting to look for a job, so that's priority. I don't have mummy or daddy's wealth to keep me going, so I'll have to do what everybody who's working class does, and that is sell their labour. I've got a book out, and it's called "If You Don't Run, They Can't Chase You," which is a quote from Michael McGahey, who was the miners' leader in Scotland, and it's basically interviews that I've done with people who've been involved in major campaigns and struggles over the years, and their testimony of what went on. Their fascinating insight into big campaigns like the Hillsborough campaign, Hillsborough Justice campaign, like the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act campaign, the ones that I've been involved in, the miners' campaign, blacklisting, a whole range of them. They're fascinating insights into some tremendous people who would really, I think, would inspire you. So look out for that coming out in July.
Brilliant.
And if you hear anybody looking for a washed-up politician for a job, give me a shout.
Neil, it's been a pleasure having you on. Both of us, thank you very much for joining us, and we wish you all the very best after Parliament.
Okay, guys, thanks a lot, and it's been a pleasure, and I wish you well with your studies, and I hope everything goes well.